Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. Nitrogen and chemical fertilizer. We don't talk about it a lot, but with energy prices at record levels in Europe, and thus the price of chemical fertilizer is directly tied to fossil fuel gas or quote-unquote natural gas, this means record prices for fertilizer. Last year, plus 300%. That is a 3 with 2 zeros. As it is an extremely potent greenhouse gas as well, we need to work with farmers to implement regenerative practices and reduce their reliance on chemical fertilizer. Our guest of today argues that we can do this by working through the banks. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, investing as if the planet mattered. A podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. In March last year, we launched our membership community to make it easy for fans to support our work. And so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits and how to become a member, check gumroad.com/investingregenag or find the link below. Thank you. Welcome to another episode today with the CEO of Agreed, helping farmers to profit naturally. Welcome, Kelly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we always start with this, you're a listener of the podcast. We start with this personal question. How did you end up working on soil and regeneration?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was a biologist by training and then had a career consulting in the pharmaceutical industry, but I increasingly became concerned about the planet's health as opposed to humans' health. And I really wanted to transition and use my background to focus on entrepreneurship that would help the climate crisis. And as a biologist, I know that soil is the foundation of everything. The only energy that we're harnessing on the planet for the most part is coming from plants, which depend on soil. So if we don't have soil health, we're not harnessing that energy and we won't be able to feed ourselves. So that's how I came to it.
And as a biologist, you mentioned we know that soil is the foundation. I don't know if all biologists, they should know, but they maybe don't. Do you remember when that realization came? Where hey, it all starts with soil or oceans, obviously, depending on what we're eating. But do you remember when that realization came and how, was it a smaller process? Was it a book? Was it a movie? Was it a tomato you ate straight from the plant? What was that trigger?
Yeah, well, it's funny. It definitely wasn't from my biology courses, which, I thought, wow, I'm a bit late to the party here to be figuring this out well after university. But it was reading Gabe Brown's book, Dirt to Soil, that really brought that light bulb moment to me, because that's when I had that aha of, oh yeah, the soil is alive. It's a living organism. It's an ecosystem. And that's what feeds the plants. That plus sunlight. And if we only have one half of that equation, we're not going to have healthy plants. And that was that epiphany for me. And if we don't have healthy plants, we can't have healthy humans because we can't feed ourselves.
And I think many people will be nodding now and say, okay, Gabe Brown, of course, I read that book as well. It's such a super interesting, but it's quite a niche book. You don't pick that up on an airport normally. How did that come to you? How did somebody say you should really read this Dirt to Soil? Soil? What was the trigger to open that or to get that book or open a book of quite a niche subject of a farmer in the US?
Yeah, well, this is kind of how did I come to focus on regenerative agriculture, which is a whole other story. But just to answer your question quickly.
We have time, eh?
We do have time. It was watching the film Kiss the Ground, which he features in. And that's what really got me understanding, I knew that there were problems with the food system from some previous work I'd done in food waste. But it was watching Kiss the Ground and understanding how we're killing the soil with the way we're currently growing things that helped me get on this mental journey. And then, of course, I picked up Gabe's book, and I actually got to speak to Gabe a while back.
Wow.
And that was a really great moment. He honestly, salt of the earth, genuinely nice guy. He took a call from me while he was just sitting at DFW airport waiting for a flight. He's that nice.
Wow. Yeah, and I've seen him speak virtually, and that's the closest we got, but that was already fascinating. Shout out to Jan Giesbert, who might be listening, who's very close to Gabe as well. I think it was at a small gathering we organized close to Berlin, where he spoke virtually because it was still COVID times. So it's but he comes through, even through a screen, he comes through very, very warm and incredibly engaged in this topic. So that's okay. That starts to make sense. You see somebody like the entry point of a documentary. I think they had an impact with that documentary, which has been quite astonishing. And then picking up a book and going deeper. And then you decided to found a company or to start working, like putting your working energy and working hours and not just your thinking hours and maybe after work on this problem. What was the first step you took there?
Yeah, well, I've always found in my career that I'm best when I'm able to funnel a passion. And, in my previous career in pharmaceuticals, that was helping cancer patients. And I really, really enjoyed that. But as I said, when I became more concerned about the planet, I wanted to pivot to entrepreneurship that would help the climate crisis. And of course, with a background in biology, I was drawn to things in that area. And I had worked, briefly at various climate tech startups working in the food space. One was a company called Winnow that was helping to reduce food waste using AI and computer vision, which was a great experience and helped me understand how much waste we have in the system, which is just really terrible.
Yeah, when you see it, I mean, you're saying with visuals, it's when you see the food waste is very different when you hear 30, 40%. We're like, 30, 40%. That's like massive. But when you see like how much, and I think this company is mostly based on restaurants and they like, it's just the sheer quantity through imagery is, you cannot see it, the listeners, but Kelly's closing her eyes and remembering the sheer quantity of the mountains of food waste. Yeah, no, that triggers something.
Yeah, and just a little bit about that, there's the amount that we're wasting. And then when you think about all of the energy and chemical inputs that went into growing that food and transporting that food, and then you think about how that food, if thrown into a landfill, turns into methane, which is 30 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas, then you just really, your jaw starts dropping, doesn't it? All that waste. It's mind-boggling.
And still, I mean, you're working with cancer patients and you're working in food waste. These are big, hairy problems to talk. You can work your full career in that, but you decided to start focusing on soil and farmers and the transition to more regenerative practices or practices that have a regenerative outcome. Like, what led you down that path? What led you to, because with Winnow, you could probably work for the next 20, 30 years. There's no issue there whatsoever. Like, food waste is going to be there for a while, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It is a big, hairy problem. And in fact, that's what they call it in Winnow. And I think, work can be stressful no matter what you're doing. And I think that I've found that if I'm working on something I really care about, it's not stressful because it's good kind of stress, right? You don't mind working hard when you know it's something that's really important and you really care about. And so as I got more into the problem of food waste and the food system, I started understanding about the problems we face in the production side of things. I thought about all that energy that was going into growing it and that was then wasted. And I worked with a company called Tried and Supplied, which is trying to get sustainable growers matched with restaurants here in the UK. And I learned more about the supply chain side of it and how difficult it is to source sustainable produce. And so that further informed it. And then I had a little detour working for a clean fintech company, which further informed the solution we came to agreed. But that company was basically trying to help create investment vehicles for decarbonization tools. Because right now, if you want to put your money in a good way, like an ESG fund, right, there's myriad funds out there to choose from. If you peel back the wrapper, you find that most of the companies in that fund are the same ones, the usual suspects. They're banks, financial services, and tech companies like Google, because they have a lower carbon footprint. They're doing less harm.
Directly, yeah. The scope 1 and 2 is a lot lower. It's the easy ones, yeah, but nobody's tackling the difficult ones.
Exactly. Nobody's tackling the real source of the problem and coming up with solutions. And so I wanted to create something that was actually becoming one of those solutions, to help draw down carbon and really help fix the system itself rather than just do less bad. So that was the thinking behind it. The actual impetus was I did a program through Cambridge and their Sustainability Leadership Institute on sustainable business. And I learned about this program called Carbon 13. It was a new venture builder for the climate crisis that they were creating. And they were going to create companies to draw down carbon. And I thought, this is it. I've worked for and with startups. I want to start my own. And it was a vehicle to meet like-minded founders who are also passionate about the climate crisis and using entrepreneurship to solve it. And so I joined that program. It was I think, middle of March, and we were the first cohort. And it was very interesting and exciting because we started during COVID, during lockdown here in the UK. So we had to meet people on Zoom and do everything by Zoom. And the program, you could kind of liken it to Love Island meets Dragon's Den, because it took, from 600 applicants, 60 individuals. And then we were supposed to meet each other and team. And then those teams had to come up with business ideas that would draw down 10 million tons of CO2 with their business practices, and then work on those ideas and then pitch to the dragons at the end for funding. And so during the teaming, it was meeting people on Zoom, kind of like trying to decide to financially marry somebody when you've never actually met in real life, which is interesting.
Sounds tricky, yeah.
Definitely. And then teams formed. And then there was intrigue and teams broke up and you're like, is this person with this team or that team? We don't know what's going on. So that was kind of the Love Island, excitement of it. And then 23 teams eventually formed and pitched for funding, and 8 went on to receive that funding. And we were one of the 8. And so it was a really great adventure.
This is a dangerous question to ask because things in startup life, as you said, we're recording this actually in February 2022, and you started in March 21. So we're even less than a year in. And I've followed this since November last year. So for like 4 months, and it's already, I wouldn't say changed dramatically, but changed over time and morphed into something else. And so I'm going to ask a dangerous question, which might be irrelevant not when we put this out, but if you're listening to this in 3 years, it might be a bit different. But what is agreed at the moment? Like, what are you, if you had to, you're doing your fundraising, so you're doing this elevator pitch 6,000 times probably. If you had to explain agreed in a few sentences, and we have more than a few sentences because I will be asking follow-up questions, but what would you say you are at the moment? We're in Feb 2022.
I love that. And I always ask the question back for the elevator pitch. Well, how tall is the building? Very
tall. We're in London. It's like we have a few minutes. Yeah.
Is it the Shard? Are we in the Shard? Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah.
Great. The answer is very simple. We're mission focused, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to regenerative agriculture. And so as long as we keep our eyes on the prize and we're in love with the problem, the solution follows. We're not focused on a solution that we're trying to shoehorn into a particular problem. And so that's why it's evolved over time, because as we focus on this problem, we understand more and more about what would actually move the needle. And so just kind of taking a step back, my team, there's 3 of us, myself, my co-founder, Sarah, who comes from a farming background and has an expertise in behavior science.
Always nice to have somebody with a farming background on the team. I'm always like the technical decks I get, and I'm scrolling very quickly to the team page and think, okay, none of them has visited a farm recently. It's tricky. But I think Robin O'Brien of Replant Capital says, yeah, I would just delete the deck. No, maybe she didn't say that. But she definitely said the amount of technology companies I see in Silicon Valley that have not visited a farm recently at all, raised an insane amount of money, burned most of it because, yeah, they were searching for a problem with the tool they had, with the solution they had. So, okay, sorry, go ahead. But anyway, your co-founder has a very concrete farming background, which is great.
Oh, yeah. No, it's great because she keeps us real. My co-founder, Reed, who comes from a tech background, and I'll say something, and she's like, oh, do you know what a farmer would say to that? It's great. Yeah.
You're laptop farmers. Yeah. Me too, by the way.
Completely. I'm Farmville, basically, compared to her,
Excel spreadsheet farmers. Yeah.
Spreadsheet farmer compared to her muddy boots. So it's really great to have that perspective. And like I said, she keeps it real and she helps us understand the farmer mindset so that we're starting where they are, as opposed to trying to run to catch them and make them see things our way. And then my co-founder, Reed, comes from engineering tech background. He commercialized weather data, satellite weather data for NASA. And Then had a lovely career pivot, as many of us do, and founded his own craft rum distillery. As he likes to say, his fun fact is he's an international award-winning rum distiller. But that's where he learned about the sustainability issues and sourcing through the supply chain and really got interested in agriculture. So the three of us came from different directions, but coalesced on this passion for agriculture, not only because it's, such a source of emissions, around 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gases, but because it's such a solution, a potential sink with so many co-benefits. And, oh, wait, we probably still want to keep eating. And if we do, we need to change things. So that's why we focused on this mission. And we're very passionate about helping farmers, because as we see it, farmers are stuck in a system. It's hard to get out of. They have been conditioned by the markets, by the CPGs, by the companies chasing, cheap, food products and everything, to chase yield almost at all cost. And I mean financial cost, and I mean environmental cost.
And mental cost, social cost as well. If we look at the countryside everywhere around the world, not just picking on the UK, it's not going amazingly. Yeah. No. They're literally being run into the ground. There's so many puns that one can do in ag. It's a little dangerous, but they are by the system. And the system needs to change. And that's difficult. System change is very difficult. So in system change, you want to look at that, the easiest off-ramp you can possibly, even not ramp, it should be an tiny off-road that is very easy to take. I mean, friend of the show, Jeroen Kromp, always likes to say, it's a very Dutch analogy, but you're sort of stuck with your bicycle in a tram track. If you've never been on a bicycle in a tram city, you don't know what I mean. But you can imagine if you're stuck with your little wheel in that tram track, you're going to follow the tram, because if you move or left or right, if you try to steer, if you even try to have some kind of agency, you'll fall over. And so that's where most farmers are, because of all of us, and not because we want them to be there or they want to be there, but because they ended up there. So the question is, how do we get the wheel out of the tram track in the least disruptive, painful, revolution way? Because that's probably not what we want.
No, exactly. The last thing we want is a whole bunch of our farmers who are, some of the best stewards of the land to then go out of business and, maybe have to sell their land to developers who will just build a bunch of flats or whatever. So, we really want to help them stay in business sustainably, both financially and ecologically. And so we, did all kinds of background research when we decided to tackle this problem and accelerate the transition to regen ag. We attended Groundswell here in the UK, which is this wonderful event. I kind of liken it to the Glastonbury, or for American listeners, Lollapalooza of regen ag, just this massive festival, just so feel good, wonderful community there. And we talked to so many farmers and really started understanding the issues that they faced, what drove them to transition to regen, the impetus that they had, and what that journey was like for them. And that really helped inform our thinking. But something, Koen, you were talking about how much we've evolved since you last spoke to us in November. When we first started working on this problem, we understood that there were two main barriers that farmers faced to even thinking about becoming regenerative. And one was an informational barrier challenge. They didn't know what to do on their specific land and their fields, because they might see their neighbor doing something different, regenerative, but they would say, well, my fields are different. My operation is different. My land is different.
Which is true, because it's, as we know, extremely context specific. Yeah.
200%. That's exactly it. It's so context specific that you can't take a cookie cutter formula and just plunk it down on another farm and expect it to work. So that's very challenging right there. It needs to be a very customized and adaptive approach as you go. Regen is a journey, not a destination. And one of the things I love about it is they're always looking to improve. I think regen farmers are some of the best scientists on the planet, the way they're always reacting to what happens and trying to find something new and better that works. So that is a challenge, if you're used to doing things in a more cookie cutter conventional way, to all of a sudden have to completely adapt what you're doing. But the other thing was, of course, finance, because as Joe Stanley says in his wonderful book, Farm to Fork, it's hard to be green when your finances are in the red. And you and I just talked about how difficult, these farmers are finding out how the system isn't working brilliantly. In the UK, because of Brexit, the farmers here are losing the subsidies that they had been receiving from the EU. And farming, hasn't been just the most profitable thing in the world to begin with the low food prices and, how much the grocery stores are willing to pay for produce and things like that. A lot of the farms here had been relying fairly heavily to even depending upon these subsidies, just almost like, insurance in case they had a bad year with the crop or things like that. And so with that going away, that makes it all the harder for them to think about doing something new that might be risky.
There's a lot of tension or stress in the market now as the new system is coming into place. It's not very clear yet. I mean, we could spend hours on this alone. It's a very interesting opportunity. I think everybody in the space globally is watching because it's this sort of forced reset of a subsidy system. And there at least is a lot of intention to move into more, let's say, outcome-based schemes and not just very simply pay because you have land. For whatever reason, whenever you took it, stole it, bought it, etc., or inherited it. And so that it's a very interesting experiment. But of course, if you're right in it and you are dependent, let's say most of your profit comes from, or your living income comes from subsidies that are disappearing almost overnight, it's very stressful. And then we're adding the input crisis we have at the moment. We're living in a time where input costs went through the roof. And yeah, that I can imagine creates a lot of stress in not the right places.
That's exactly it. You mentioned the environmental land management scheme, ELMS, and this is very, very true. So an outcome-based, environmentally focused scheme to help replace this subsidy that, to be honest, farmers kind of received just for the fact that they farmed land. There is kind of no strings attached money. For the most part, it went to the bottom line, which, was very helpful for farmers and is one of the reasons that, a robust crop insurance system hasn't really developed here in the UK. And so with the loss of that, they're losing that buffer that what functioned as insurance. And the land management scheme that may be coming in, that, as you said, is more outcomes based, there's a few issues with it. Nobody knows exactly how it's going to play out, but
that's issue number one. As an entrepreneur, that's difficult to plan for if you're running your farm, obviously, as a company. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the National Farmers Union, the NFU here, is having a conference next week, and one of their talks is is uncertainty the new business norm or something like that? So yes, it's very hard to plan.
And I can tell you it is, and it will be, because nobody's going to be super happy with 100% happy with all of these, but it's coming. There's massive changes coming.
Oh, the one thing is certain is change.
Yeah, the one thing is certain is, so how does that... You're saying we want to help create this off-ramp, we want to help farmers transition. What's the entry point? What's the least, I wouldn't say easiest because none of this is easy, but what's the first step or the first entry point for a new company like Agreed? It's not that you've been around for a long time, you have a stable business somewhere else and you're going to do also some new things. Now, this is the main business. What did you decide as the focal point, as the knife edge? There are many other facets, obviously, but the point of the knife to enter this and to meet the farmers where they are. And then help them where they want to go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you think like a farmer and you're losing this subsidy that was kind of your insurance buffer and your input costs are rising at the same time, it's basically a perfect financial storm that farmers are facing here. And we realized that nitrogen actually was the key to everything. It was the starting point of the journey. Because the price of nitrogen fertilizer last year alone rose about 300%, which is just huge.
3 and 2 zeros, listeners, 3 and 2 zeros. That's 3 times. So imagine your main input cost, one of the main input costs, overnight went 3x. Okay, that's, significant.
Exactly. 3x. And that's the thing that kind of ensures you get that yield that you are incentivized to chase. And so that, was huge, to say the least. And we realized that nitrogen's the key because, first of all, it is one of the biggest sources of, the carbon footprint of a farm. I think a lot of people are focused on carbon, and rightfully so. But in some ways, this is almost like an etymological problem because actually what we're focused on is greenhouse gases and warming. And if you think about that, nitrogen is one of the biggest causes of greenhouse gases in farming because of the Haber-Bosch process that's used to produce it with methane, which consumes about 2% of the world's energy, which is just mind-boggling when you think about it. And then you spend all that energy and fossil fuels to create this nitrogen fertilizer. When you put it on the fields, you have the other 50% of the emissions, which is actually in the form of nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas, 300 times more potent than CO2, that is released in the fields. Nitrous oxide is actually a component of smog as well, so you've got an air pollution factor. So it's just this huge carbon footprint, all just to grow our food.
Carbon equivalent, that's, I think, the important part here. So we, just to summarize, and then we get to the part that doesn't even get its effect, basically, because most of it is wasted. But just to understand, this is a greenhouse gas that we say always carbon equivalent, or we should always say carbon dioxide equivalent, or greenhouse gases, as there are many different ones. This is one that's 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide or CO2. And it's created with a lot of energy, which I know people are working on. But let's say the fertilizer issue on just the production side, and then you write it on your land or you spread it. And most of it doesn't end up on a plant. Most of it is being, like, the oxide comes off which creates huge amounts of smog. And all of it. So it's a massively wasteful stuff, which by any means has created a lot of benefits as well. A lot of cheap calories we've been producing over the last, more or less a century, probably a bit more. But it's creating an enormous wasteful process that has to change. Like if you're concerned by energy use, this has to change. If you're concerned about smog and lung health, and I mean, we've just been in 2 years of mayhem because of a lot of issues, let's say, around breathing and issues of smog. It's definitely a thing. I mean, many people die of smog every year. Or if you're worried about farmers' financial health, because this is a massive cost, it went up 300%. Yeah. This is something we don't talk about enough. Nitrogen. And it's an essential thing for plants to grow. The issue is when you put chemical fertilizer, most of it doesn't end up in plants, right? What's the percentage?
Yeah. Oh, goodness. I mean, there's so much variation in that, but what I can say is the vast majority let's say, the first, 50 to 60% of the nitrogen that you put on the ground is probably going to be going into the plant and producing that yield. And the rest that they put is just chasing incremental yield because it's not bioavailable to the plant. And that leads to the other problem. I mean, there's so many, but the big problem of runoff.
What is runoff? It sounds weird, but just for anybody who doesn't live next to a farm on a rainy day, what is a runoff?
Yeah, so the nitrogen that can't be absorbed by the plant then is washed off the field by rain and, will enter the watershed, enter the water system. Just last month, it was announced that 100% of the rivers in the UK are polluted. Now, of course, that is not only nitrogen fertilizer or nitrate, but that is a big component of it, for sure. And it causes algal blooms and eutrophication in the waterways. It's just so bad. It's a massive issue.
It's a massive issue. And there are ways, and we can talk about that for a long time, but let's say with applying practices with the goal of regenerating soil, etc., will dramatically reduce, depending how you apply them, how you mix them with the cover crops, keeping the soil covered, reduces runoff, making a lot more of the nitrogen that is already in the soil bioavailable, getting the microbial life back into action, biodiversity, etc., etc. I mean, all of those things we know they can dramatically reduce or completely reduce the need for chemical fertilizer. But as we know that, and we've seen examples, the Cape Browns and many others that have shown that, like the question is now, okay, how do you make sure that a good chunk and as many as possible of the farmers in the UK start with them? And what's the best start, best point? And how do we incentivize them? Because, of course, we cannot ask them, as they are deeply in red, to also start paying for new machinery or paying for cover crop mixes. And because this transition costs money, or at least you have yield drops, etc., to take care of it the first year. So as we know that, we know it's an issue. And now, how do we attack that?
Yeah, exactly. We have to meet the farmers where they are and understand things from their vantage point. They are financially squeezed. So even if they had the information and totally understood how exactly to do it on their land, again, they are financially probably unable to take on that risk without this buffer there anymore.
Nobody would. Let's just be clear. Nobody would take on that risk. If you would be the company owner, you wouldn't take on that risk.
Farms are businesses. Farms are businesses, and we have to speak their language, which is finance. And so that's where we realized that there was a real opportunity here, actually, as they're losing the subsidies and as prices are high and, likely to stay high for quite a while. It's an opportunity to help them switch on to regenerative practices, which reduce their reliance on chemical nitrogen fertilizer through very simple gateway practices like using cover crops that help fix nitrogen naturally from the air. So that's where we started. But again, if they start on this journey, they're going to need to figure out how it works best for their land, their practice. That's that context again. And so what we realized the opportunity was to help them access finance that would de-risk that transition for them. Because as they figure things out, they may have a drop in yield. They're going to have to try things, experiment a little bit, figure out what works on their land, and honestly rehabilitate their soil and build back up that natural fertility. Because the one thing about nitrogen fertilizer you and I didn't cover yet is the fact that it actually kind of kills the soil microbial life that provides that natural fertility. It disrupts the natural market that exists between a plant and the soil microbes, where the plant is exuding carbon to feed the soil microbes, and they then release minerals and nutrients back to the plant. It's a virtuous cycle. It's like a market, underground market that you didn't know was happening all the time. And so if the plant is getting a lot of this nutrient from above in a chemical form, it kind of doesn't need to work as hard to feed the microbes, and they don't get as much carbon, and then they don't exude as much nutrients as well. So yeah, it's disrupting that, and the farmers aren't building their soil organic matter as much as they could be by relying on nitrogen. And that keeps the farmer on this input financial treadmill where they're reliant upon it to chase that yield.
And so how do we get them off the treadmill? Like, what's the angle? I mean, you can, of course, go out, and we've had them on the podcast, the Perennial Fund and Replant Capital to a certain extent, and some others that are trying to build transition finance too, and are building transition finance funds, which we've seen is a lot of work, of course, but also huge, like, to raise money for this is not easy at all. You decided to take another route. You decided to see where the money already is, or where the risk already is, which is a very interesting one. So where did you say, okay, let's get transition finance, but let's not set up a massive fund or a crowdfunding platform or lending platform on our own?
Yeah. And first of all, a shout out to you and your podcast, because that really helped inform our understanding of the issue with the Mad Agriculture Perennial Fund interviews and the one with, or the many, I should say, with New Foundation Farms, and really understanding that there are people creating funds and trying to purchase land to then switch it over. And we're actually working with one of those funds, which I can mention later. But we realized, again, going back to the mission, since we're mission driven and the mission is to help farmers transition, we realized that in order to move the needle at scale, we needed to work with people who had those relationships with farmers already, rather than trying to go farm to farm.
Knocking on the door. Yeah.
Knocking on the door. Exactly. And we also, as part of our mission, just to make things more challenging for ourselves, because, trying to save the planet, and, entrepreneurship in agriculture weren't challenging enough. We have a mission where we do not want to charge farmers. We want to help farmers and put money back into their pockets. And so we needed a way to do this at scale with people who have relationships with farmers, but in a way that could get finance to them where they're not paying themselves for this transition. And so we realized that there was an opportunity with banks. Banks have relationships with the vast majority of farmers in the country. And also, thanks to some recent developments, banks now have a statutory obligation to report on the carbon footprint and exposure of their book of debt, and to also be moving that book of debt towards net zero by 2040, which is wonderful.
But nobody knows how to do that.
Well, it's also a problem for the banks.
If you're an agriculture bank, your emissions are going to come from practices, are going to come by your clients, your farmers. And so you're going to need to work with them to help them implement different ways, just like you have to work with your real estate portfolio if you happen to be large on that, to start changing the light bulbs, insulating, depending on what's the state of the real estate. But there are a lot of things you can do to bring it wouldn't say to net zero immediately, but actually energy positive if you wanted to, but very close. I mean, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, which is interesting for a bank as well, because most of these are finance questions, like yield drop in 3 years, but then interesting returns after. That's a financial question. If you want to go to organic, there are premiums. We can model it out. We can figure that out if you want to go. I mean, I know I heard yesterday some interesting premiums for regen organic in the US if you're certified. Like there are brands now, this is a finance question. The time with finance, you can sort of travel, you can bridge the 3 years to 5 years, whatever your field needs, if there are obviously interesting financial incentives after, which could be great contracts, offtake agreements, which could be Elms that finally wakes up at that time, or other things. But this should get bankers very excited, because this is we need financial products to bridge that. But then we need intermediaries, or at least people to connect with the farmers to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to help these farmers.
Do they get excited about it, or just they get scared, like the banks? The conversations, because you have had many with the banks recently, are they interested and seeing this as an opportunity, or are they being like, we need to move now because this thing is coming and we're going to report and there's a lot of extra reporting we need to do because as banks we already need to do so much. Mm-hmm. What have you seen, or do some of them see it as an opportunity now?
Oh, definitely. I think the reaction that we've gotten with the many conversations we've had, while mixed, everybody has been interested and supportive. And in fact, we actually have 3 letters of interest from 3 banks about this particular solution that we're working on, which is really wonderful. One of the things to mention, you don't need to be an ag-only bank for this to be a real issue, because many banks lend in many different areas. Ag might even be a small portion of their lending. But the fact is that because agriculture has such an outsized footprint of carbon, it's actually an outsized area of exposure and risk.
Reporting, yeah. And risk is interesting here, because if these farmers keep going bankrupt because we push them the bank at the end is on the hook because they have a lot of money outstanding there, especially in bad seasons. So there's a huge risk component, not just the reporting, there's a risk component here as well. And the better financial health your farmers are, your tenants, just if you have a real estate building, the easier your job is as a bank, obviously. So how do you work with banks? Or are you going to work with, because you have letters of interest? What's the idea? I mean, this can change if you reach out to Kelly in a month or so. The exact details of this might be slightly different. But at the moment, how do you envision that?
Yeah, well, just taking a step back a little bit about the opportunity for banks here that we realized, and this is what really aligns those incentives along the lines of what you were talking about with the tram lines, right? It's aligning interests and incentives. The banks, of course, have this reporting obligation. One of the problems they face is just such a massive thing to quantify, just trying to quantify it. I talked to one ESG manager in a bank, and she was saying, well, we're taking averages of averages to figure out how much carbon is sequestered in a hedgerow. I was like, yeah, well, how long's a piece of string? I mean, that's just such a impossible question to answer, and an impossible or useless method to arrive at the answer. So the point is that they're scrambling, trying to fill in these numbers. And we realized that nitrogen actually is a wonderful component area to focus on, because as we talked about, it's such a part of the problem, but it's also incredibly easy to quantify. Farmers know exactly how much nitrogen they are putting, to the kilogram, most likely, on their fields. And there are many ways of tracking that and looking at it over time. And so we realized that we have an opportunity through our data to help banks not only quantify their exposure on this one key metric, but also benchmark them against regen farmers who have reduced using regen practices, so that we could say, hey, bank, your farmers are way up here. In, let's say, 5 years' time, based on our data, we could see that they could reasonably reduce, 10 to 15% of that, which is a huge chunk of carbon, CO2e, equivalent. And at the end of that period, they would be more financially resilient because they would be less reliant on this expensive and fluctuating input. So, most likely, data says that regen farms are at least, if not more, profitable once they've reduced those inputs. And in addition, they're going to be more resilient ecologically, because regen practices, for example, using cover crops, keeping the ground covered throughout the year and having living roots and relying more on natural fertility, means that those farmers can weather events better, like floods and droughts, which we know are increasing with climate change. So here you go, bank. Your farmer is hurting right now, your customer. You have a means that can help them through this difficult time as input costs are high and as they lose these subsidies, that at the end of it will mean that your customer is better off and you have a lower risk customer. So you save them from going out of business and you help them, future-proof their business for going forward. So that's a real win-win.
And so how will they be financing it? Is it lowering maybe it's both, lowering the interest rate if a farmer, let's say, start with the program, there's no the program, but with the practices and starts learning from nearby regen farmers, starts learning, etc. Or is it actually, let's finance your machinery and let's finance the cover crop mix, or let's increase the depth, which is a risk to do that transition? Where do you see that? Like, let's pile on more depth on farmers, which some people will cringe now when I say it. Or let's lower the interest rate, which I know some people are working on, like replant capital. Like if you're doing certain things connected to soil health, we can lower the interest rate you're paying, which what the Triodos Bank is doing. If you have a house that is on a lower level of energy use, you actually pay less in mortgage because the risk is lower.
Yeah, well, the answer is I see it as all of the above. I see this as a real opportunity for innovation in regenerative finance, because, of course, it could be a lower interest loan. And I think it should be, to be honest with you. One of our missions is to shift the needle on risk.
For the bank or the farmer, or both?
For both. Because both banks and farmers now see conventional farming as normal and regen as risky. And the truth couldn't be any further from that. It's actually regen, which in the long run is going to be much less risky, much more resilient, and conventional, which is driving farmers into the ground and, driving the climate into crisis. And so we want to make the case for regen being lower risk, and therefore it should be rewarded as such through lower rates, just like you were talking about with Triodos Bank and mortgages and things like that. So we want to make that case, and we want to take it straight to the banks, who can then take it straight to their customers and offer creative finance. It could be lower interest loans. It could be other things like, grants up front, simply because it reduces that bank's risk. There's all kinds of ways that they can do it. And I think that comes back to one of our other ethos, which is optionality. We don't believe in telling farmers, you have to do this. What we think is the better way to go is to help them see a goal that would be beneficial to them, like lowering their reliance on nitrogen, and then putting options in front of them of ways they could achieve that goal and letting them choose the one that's right for them. So that's why we've built our platform to help connect farmers to other farmers who are doing regen practices so that they can...
That don't necessarily have to be a customer of the same bank. I mean, this could be any farmer nearby that is in a similar position, in a similar context, but farming very differently. So you can see, feel, touch, smell, etc., how a transition like that could work.
Exactly. Seeing is believing. We know that getting farmers to visit each other and having those farm walks, that's very, very helpful in bringing these practices to life for them. Farmers learn best from other farmers, and that's how this is really going to spread. If this were just a data issue, it might be solved by now, because there is a lot of data. There's a lot of decision support tools out there, and more power to them. But to get that mental shift and the confidence for that farmer to begin on that journey, they're going to need the financial security that even if they do have a drop in yield, they're not literally betting and losing the farm. And they also need that psychological just kind of security of knowing that there are other people who've been there before, who've done this, and, kind of give them some advice. If X happens, that farmer knows what it's like and has some thoughts on what to do in that context. So I think you cannot eliminate the human element of this. Farming is a competitive sport, but it's also very collaborative at the same time. It's one of those central paradoxes of it that I love. And so we want to facilitate that. So we've built this platform to connect farmers to each other and help visualize what regen looks like.
So a farmer arrives, let's say a farmer arrives now, registers him or herself on the platform, and then you suggest, like, look, actually, not so far away from you, there are people doing very interesting things. You might have heard about them, etc. But it's actually, and those farmers that, like these, let's say the regen farmers that are a few years ahead, are they open to getting, because they might get a lot of these requests now from, I would love to have a farm walk. I would love to see, like, how do you manage that process of, because seeing is believing, But these farmers also have to farm. It's not that they can do farm tours all day, every day, the whole month. I mean, then nothing gets done. So how do you manage that process without overwhelming let's say, the mentors?
Yeah, well, so really great point. So I think that connecting with other farmers is important, but also connecting with agronomy advisors who specialize in regen is important. And these farmers exist, and we are, aggregating them on our platform so you can kind of have one-stop shopping, find somebody near you who fits your philosophy. But regen advisors right now, most of them, and I was talking to some at the recent BASE conference here in the UK of regen farmers, they do regen advising, but it's not their entire book of business. They couldn't probably support themselves right now only on regen. And so we'd love to change that. We'd love to funnel new farmers getting on this journey to them so that they can only focus on regen, which is their passion.
And again, in this case, the farmer wouldn't pay, but the advisor would pay you, or even not. Like in terms of business for agreed, the farmer doesn't pay, which means that it has to come from the agronomist advisor.
So what we are doing is building this platform free for farmers, and we're not, as it currently stands, charging anybody to be on the platform. We want this to be a freely available resource for the agronomy advisors, for the farmers, for brands like you talked about. There's brands like Root Zero Potatoes, which are growing carbon neutral potatoes, and Wild Farmed Wheat, which you may know of.
I'm smiling because they should come on, but it will take a few more months. But yeah, we're in touch with Wild Farmed. I'll put a link below if you want to know more about grain and very innovative ways of farming that. Definitely check out the website of Wild Farmed.
Oh my goodness, we could do an entire podcast session on wheat and nitrogen, I think. That's a whole other topic. But at any rate, we're putting these resources for farmers to plug into, even the carbon markets. A lot of times we've gotten questioned, well, there's so much, happening in the carbon market space. How are you going to be different? And we don't see ourselves as in competition at all with the carbon markets. We see ourselves as the beginning of that journey. By getting off of nitrogen reliance, the farmers can then really begin sequestering that carbon in their soil. So if they want to go ahead and sell those credits later, they can. And we have put different markets on our platform for them to potentially plug into, markets like Agrina. So we support that, but it's up to the farmer. All we want to do is help them reduce their reliance on nitrogen. And we are working with the banks to do that. And so that's where our funding, our financial model comes from, is working with the banks.
Business model comes from.
Yes, exactly. So we want to be free to farmers.
I mean, in terms of finding a business model, go where the money is to a certain extent. And
banks are known for having money. So.
Are known for managing large amounts and having small margins, but are still managing to be remarkably profitable over the last years. And yeah, that's definitely an interesting choice, and not trying to take a spread on the carbon side of things, or it's where a lot of noise is happening, a lot of focus. But what's very interesting, I think, of this conversation is that the big elephant in the room is nitrogen and nitrogen oxide, which is very potent. Let's not underestimate that. And it's very visible, literally because of smoke, and very visible, literally because of runoff. And probably, let's say, the rest of the general world, as we're going into the carbon hype, will start hopefully paying attention to nitrogen, because it's much more eminent also on the balance sheet of a farmer and the balance sheet of a bank, apparently. Yeah.
And the balance sheet of a bank. That's exactly it. And, shout out to Mark Carney for really bringing the financial system into the climate crisis solution and driving this change. And, I think he's been a big part of this focus on getting banks to report on this, and also shift their financing away from the source of the problem, or trying to reduce it. And, banks have played an outsized role in funding the sources of the climate crisis. And I think that they are really starting to step up and recognize that, and then try to instead fund the solution. And my goodness, this is a big part of that solution.
And to end with a few final questions, as we can talk about nitrogen and all of that for hours, but I want to keep that for another interview. If you would be in that investor chair, like let's say you had £1 billion to invest, or 10 billion, like a large amount, what would you focus on? What would be your priorities to get funded or to invest in? Because this is an investment fund. It can be very long term. I don't care. But what would you focus on?
Yeah, well, I again, kind of would want to focus on solutions to the problem, things that are helping draw down carbon as opposed to just being less bad. But I think the other thing is always start with the problem in entrepreneurship. Value is created when you solve a problem for somebody. And so look at what the problems are in the system. And some of these problems may not be considered as sexy, but they're real burning hair. For example, I can think of, more sustainable farmers, regen farmers wanting to sell more directly to customers, because right now it's very difficult for them to get any kind of premium on their produce. There's not a regen certification like there is for organic. There's not a known crafted market for those products. Consumer awareness of what regen even is right now is still quite low. So that would be a real problem area that the farmers themselves are facing. And, we've talked about the challenges with the transition. Well, once you have transitioned, how do you get rewarded for having done that transition?
You need markets.
Exactly. You need markets. Another thing would be, you could sell direct to consumers, but combinable crops, they have a real challenge because their produce just gets lumped in with unsustainable, high input produce and sold at the same low price. So somebody who can help solve that problem, that would be huge. And you'd probably be able to further incentivize a bigger shift, these massive crops away from high inputs, if they knew that they could get rewarded for it on the other end.
Yeah, the more we talk about it, actually, it should be live. No, it will go live today, actually. Paul Lightfoot, an interview. I always mess up the production schedule. Paul Lightfoot, I'll put it in the chat as well, or in the description below, runs a newsletter, is an investor himself, and we interviewed him on carbon negative food, so negative foods as he called it. So that's the biggest lever for him, at least. And we had a very interesting discussion on creating these markets. Consumers want it. Carbon labeling is coming. And now it's up to us to create the brands that pay the farmer and the farmers, but also make sure we tell and explain and share that story of soil and the complexity. But there's some very interesting things happening. I mean, you mentioned wild farmed, but there are luckily others that are moving that needle, because we need much better brands. We need much better produce, products, processed things, because not everything can be sold fresh. Grain, as a great example, to get it in our house, to get it in our shopping carts, or to get it in our home, which is, probably you can put $1 billion to work there, or £1 billion if you wanted to. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So when those brands pop up, or crop up, I should say, then we can put them on our platform, because at the end of the day, we're an ecosystem player and we want to support all the players who are doing good in this space. So yeah, we are going through banks to reach their customers to help get them financing for this transition, to de-risk it for them. And that's how we see ourselves as moving the needle.
And final question, if you had a magic wand, what would you change in the space? In any space. I mean, this could be literally global consciousness if you wanted to, or better taste, which probably what I would say. But in terms of flavor and in terms of clothes or decoration or anything, I'm literally only talking about food. But what would you change if you had the magic power to change one thing only?
Oh my God, so many things. But the one thing I would change is externalities. Right now, the polluter doesn't pay. And right now, the farmer is being vilified as the polluter, even though the entire system incentivizes the farmer to farm this way right now. And so if we simply costed in the environmental cost of this nitrogen, the chemical inputs, then it would not be remotely economical to farm this way. It's already kind of becoming that way, because the cost of nitrogen is predicated on the cost of natural gas and energy, which, as we all know, especially here in Europe, has risen a lot recently. So I would cost that in, and that would drive system change. But I also understand that that's very politically unpopular and would lead to all kinds of other problems, like much higher food costs, which could hurt a lot of people too. So I don't want to pretend that it is a simple solution, but I think that those externalities are a huge driver of the problem that we've found ourselves in, this massive rut.
Absolutely. The true cost of the food we pay, I think, they did the study. The Rockefellers paid for the study in the US. I think it's 3x what we pay in the US yearly for food. And the true cost in terms of health and environmental and social, what they could calculate, so imagine it's still a lot higher, is about 3x. That's saying we should charge that now and everything should be 3x, because of course that would lead to huge disruption. But we need to figure out an off-ramp of that as well, because we're paying it anyway. Not that it's coming, the bill is coming. And we're already paying for the dirty rivers. We're paying for a lot of this indirectly and directly on the health side of things. So it's definitely coming.
Absolutely. And farmers right now, it's not the most profitable model even right now without it being priced in. And in the UK, like a lot of other places, but definitely the UK, our cost of food here is actually quite low compared to how it used to be like right post-war and everything. And even then, we have people in food poverty, and the use of food banks has grown exponentially just in the past decade. So Houston, we have a problem, and we really need a lot of creative minds to work towards solving it. And I hope that maybe your podcast can really inspire a lot more to get working on this.
Let's hope so. We need more people in the space building things, that's for sure. I want to thank you so much, Kelly, for your time in this wild journey that you're on, and looking forward to follow it, to check in over time, and to see how we can get some of those big banks to start changing, working with their customers, actually working with instead of
working with their customers.
And being part of the solution, just as we want farming to be part of the solution.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Koen. I really appreciate it.
If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my membership community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on gumroad.com/investingregenag or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.